So there's this convoluted web of opaque structures and the colonial-inspired tax havens and the accounting industry and the legal professions involved in business finance. There's going to be now a ramping up of Western capital, this old colonial money, where you're going to really see the power of Wall Street and London come through the financial markets, poured into India. And Adani and Modi know this. And that means that it creates the conditions for mass exploitation, very regressive policy. And it's a very, very dangerous situation.
There's a lot happening at the moment in opposition to the new labour codes that have been brought in. Actually drew on, on Hindu scriptures like Manusmriti. It justifies, extreme violence against Dalits and oppressed castes, extremely patriarchal. The Hindu supremacists actually would like to replace India's constitution with this. You can see the way in which, Hindutva ideology and these attacks by capital are so, inextricably intertwined, really.
The Modi-Adani regime, the Hindutva regime, was this surgical strike on domestic Indian assets to put them into the financial system. And now that's having that, the ability to be betted on, gambled on, traded through a proliferation of financial market instruments that UK Hindutva personnel, use and operate themselves, and not seeing the contradiction there.
We also have to look at the fact that we're now talking about fascism in a post-colonial context, in the global south. And we're also talking about it in a neoliberal or post-neoliberal era. So I think those make, very important differences in how we understand fascism, and particularly the idea that, the kind of nationalism or hyper-nationalism, which is part of that fascism, it doesn't involve any kind of economic nationalism. Essentially, it involves a promotion of complete subordination of India to
Exactly.
the US and to other imperial powers. And I think that's what, in a way, one of the things which the case of Adani illustrates so clearly.
You basically can't say anything against this Modi-Adani regime, as journalists have been pointing out. The first session that we recorded with them talked quite plainly, quite evidently about the rise of Narendra Modi through the ranks of the RSS and BJP and Gujarat to the Prime Minister's office, and small-time Gautam Adani into, a few years ago, the third richest man in the world, a billionaire. All journalists have been doing is pointing out the obvious, pointing out the way in which Modi has rolled out the red carpet for India's vast public sector and strategic assets, so-called strategic assets, to be handed over to essentially this one person and now this family who have immense power. We stand in solidarity with all those journalists, and we want to keep this conversation going. And we're here today to try and put some more facts and evidence out there that just quite plainly shows how this regime has gone from strength to strength, and show the way in which the financial system, the international financial system, and the way in which the domestic financial system has evolved to create this mass transfer of wealth, the core assets of Indian infrastructure, and Indian service provision into the hands of the very few.
And I think one of the things that, comes out of that analysis is also the way in which this was a mutually beneficial relationship between Adani and Modi. So particularly after the Gujarat genocide, the mass killing of Muslim communities in Gujarat in 2002, it was Adani who really took the lead in rehabilitating Modi. And other corporates followed suit, creating this discourse of vibrant Gujarat and so on, Modi as the potential CEO of India.
Vibrant Gujarat was conceptualized in 2003 by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was then the Chief Minister of Gujarat.
Vibrant Gujarat Global Summit. One man leading from the front. One idea reigning supreme. 20 years, bringing about an impactful transformation. 100,000 MOUs signed, nearly 75,000 commissioned or at various stages of completion. $55 billion in foreign direct investments. With perseverance and conviction, Shri Narendra Modi conceptualized Vibrant Gujarat, a visionary initiative that has blossomed into a premier global platform for business networking.
I think what we're going to do today, which is really important, is to actually look not only at what's happening in India, but as you said, at the role of global finance capital, and specifically to look really at why we need an understanding of imperialism to fully understand how Adani operates. What's really important about some of the research you've been doing recently, Keval, is that it then shows as you said, the other side of the story, which is the international financing of Adani, and it really makes those links then between global imperialism and fascism in India, and I think that's really, really important. And I think, there's a story sometimes that, India is this kind of rising player in the global, in the global scene, as it were. And, of course, that has been accompanied by massive growth of inequality, and it is, enmeshed with fascism within India. But I think the part which perhaps has been talked about less is the extent to which Adani is embedded in and dependent on finance capital, which is still so much located. It's still so much centered on particularly the city of London and Wall Street. So as you found, the main investors being the US, the UK, and Europe. So it is really a matter of imperialism, and I think you're also going to talk about what that means for for ordinary people's lives in India.
So thinking through international financing of Adani, it's worth having a brief look at the sort of financial environment within India, the liberalization of Mumbai into a major Asian financial capital. And one of the ways in which we see that growth is the proliferation of domestic banks over the last decade, over the last 15 years. And that banking reform also tied with quantitative easing and the ballooning of the amount of supply of finance capital, domestic finance capital. There was a demand for that capital to come into the banking sector, to come into the finance sector, and looking for investments. And that's what Adani first leveraged, which is the banking reform and the quantitative easing that was going on in India, having that growth spurred on a domestic basis through domestic banks, And then that gave the City of London and Wall Street confidence that actually India now is awash with money. You know, there is finance capital within the sector. There's a proven model now. You know, after the 70s and 80s, when New York and London had their explosion of financial markets, when the banking reforms and the delinking of gold. 20 years later, we see that happening in Mumbai and in Asia, and that paved the way for what we're seeing in the last 10 years, which is a number of Indian banks entering into the banking sector, financing Adani significantly. What the data that I've been able to pick up shows that since 2014, when Modi came to power, nearly $10 billion worth of investments, loans, underwriting of shares, underwriting of bonds have been supplied through the domestic market, and that does give certainty to finance, to global finance.
I think one other thing which you have talked about, and I think, because when people know something about Adani, they usually know that Adani is a coal giant, they know about the mining, they may know about, Adani's collaboration with Elbit to manufacture the drones which are being used in genocide in Gaza. But I think one of the things which you've looked at is the extent to which public utilities have been handed over by the Modi regime to Adani and privatized. And I think that's, I think you have something very interesting to say there about the implications of that for people.
So you're right, there's the transfer of public assets into the private sector, and that transfer has largely been through debt that Adani has taken on to get its financing, to get admittedly large capital projects, which absolutely the public sector could have done, but ideologically chose not to, and put that investment into the private sector. And there's this notion now that public utilities in India, in the way that we see public utilities occurring through the West, have been financialized, where companies have taken on extreme amount of debt, services have reduced, your citizens are viewed as basically perpetual debt servants of these public utilities, and that brings up about a question that these utilities, energy, water, gas, coal, the transport that you rely on to get to work, and then hospitals and the education system, the general trend of privatization being owned in the private sector using debt as a form of financing, and then loading that onto people whose very existence is based on the provision of these services, which capitalists are making extraordinary returns on. It sets up this level of debt servitude, I think, into perpetuity, unless there's a serious, significant structural change in the way that these companies are owned, taken back into public ownership, and reconfigured essentially and devolved as well. You mentioned that the growth of Adani has included mining in protected areas and areas that have a huge long history of Adivasi communities looking after that land and whose cultures are tied to that land, as well as the growth of Adani joint ventures and business models into other areas, including militarism, with a joint venture with Elbit Systems. And all of those campaigns and struggles were in the public eye. And they were in the public eye to 2014 onwards. There was mass struggles against Adani, who was going to mine in Hasdeo Forest, Hundreds of villages came together, struggles led by women, making international news. Lots of international NGOs and civil society from the UK and from the US were involved. But in London and in Wall Street, those banks still provided the majority of international financing to Adani. And what we find is that when they were asked about, when companies, I remember, at the time, activists and campaigners were going into the AGMs of Standard Chartered and Barclays Bank, who are the most prolific banks in London, talking about, financing, the coal machinery in India and elsewhere, and the banks hiding behind the idea that, well, our funds go into a particular part of the business, a different part of the business, a different entity. But what we find with Adani structure is through the use of opaque structures, through the use of shell companies, through convoluted corporate structures enabled by the accounting and legal professions in London, that the capital is moving around. So you see, if you were to look at the financing over the last 10 years of Adani, it doesn't stop when these struggles are in the public eye, when there have been violence in these communities caused by militia, by paramilitary goons. It continues. You see the financing continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been like a tremendous amount of resistance, and I think in a way, this, what we've been talking about also reflects the links between those struggles and broader struggles against fascism in India, which those are very much, one of the core elements. Adivasi struggles against mining have been, one of the really core elements of that wider struggle against fascism in India. And this sort of Modi-Adani nexus, which is so central to it.
We should also briefly talk about Hindenburg.
Yeah,
and that came out in January 2023. A major scandal. Hindenburg themselves, US-based short seller, said that the activities that they've uncovered is tantamount to the world's biggest corporate scandal, the world's biggest corporate fraud in history. And they uncovered a number of strange practices. One of the interesting things that happened as a result of that was $150 billion was wiped off the value of Adani shares in the aftermath of that. But the more interesting story is that 70% of that has basically been recovered. So the market cap of Adani and the financing of Adani, especially by US firms, Jefferies Financial, GQC Partners, Elara Capital, propping up the international reputation of Adani, has been very, very interesting to see. They've given nearly 10 billion in loans and underwriting new share issues, underwriting new bond issues, and their own investment funds have taken proprietary positions in Adani stock as well, which tells us something about the way in which imperialism and finance capital operates, which is that these investment funds that come out of the US, and including BlackRock and Vanguard, who together have invested heavily in Adani, whose assets under their management rivals the GDP of countries, and that's as well as pension funds, they're all invested in stock markets, and that includes exposure to the Adani-Modi fascist regime through Adani stocks. The growth of Adani as a company would not be made possible, as we said in our first session, without Modi. But the way in which people's investments, day-to-day investments, and the idea that our pensions, are this grand thing that we must protect. We never discuss it in that conversation. Well, the returns that investments are making are based on the profits of companies like Adani. And how do we square that? I think that it's just not discussed. It doesn't. It's a conversation that we've never had in the city. When I was working there, it's a very strange silence. So we see the US banking sector, we see the US financial institutions and asset managers and pension fund industry, and the same financial players in Western Europe as well, having huge investments in Adani. We also see the proliferation of Adani loans to Adani, and underwriting of bonds and shares by sort of the smaller financial capitals away from Wall Street and London and the Netherlands and France and Germany are there as well, as well as Gulf countries, especially Dubai. You've got Singapore is a key location for financial investments in Adani, and it's sizable. These together, we're talking $10 to $20 billion worth of investments since 2014, since Modi came to power. Australia is part of that conversation as well, and obviously Australia is where Adani has the world's biggest open pit mining in Carmichael, lasting repercussions on a global level.
And it's also indigenous land, but there's been a lot of resistance from those communities as well.
There has. Those communities and campaigners on the ground have realised is that rather than the Australian civil society preventing money going to financing from Sydney into Carmichael itself, we see that during the struggles against Carmichael by Indigenous communities, financing going to Adani enterprises based in Mumbai. And the work that activists in Australia have uncovered is this network of organizations, including Mauritius-based shell companies that are connected to Adani enterprises in Mumbai, so filtering and siphoning money received from Western banks to Mauritius-based companies, Bahama-based companies, Cayman Islands is involved, and then financing being drifted towards Carmichael. We also see very strange patterns that the Hindenburg report unearthed, which is how Adani, the Adani family, which is still the majority shareholder of Adani, of the Adani sort of corporate monster, has tried to protect its revenue and increase its profits by employing agents around the world to create huge investment funds, including a Dubai-based national, a Taiwanese-based national, to receive these investment funds and then on the open market buy Adani shares of the bit that Adani has released, that the family has released into the public market. So it goes back to them. So it goes back to them, exactly. So there's this convoluted web of opaque structures and sort of colonial-inspired tax havens and the accounting industry and the legal professions involved in business finance is enabling all of this.
Can you just say a little bit more what you mean by colonial-inspired tax havens?
We think of Switzerland as a bit of a tax haven, and Luxembourg as well. There's also this network of islands around the world that are owned by the British Crown, right? That on one hand, play up this idea that they're independent and we can't control them, and they're the devolved power. But on the other hand, know exactly what's happening and will be defended militarily if necessary, to make sure that the lawyers and accountants in London have an ability to create shell companies and register them in these small island states. It is interesting that tax havens, are in the Caribbean. There is a history there of mass exploitation, enslavement, and colonialism, and they have now become vehicles for the movement of immense amount of finance capital. There's one building that has a few dozen employees that has 5,000 to 10,000 companies registered there, hiding who the beneficial owners of companies are.
No, I mean, that's really interesting. And I think also like connections to be made there with, the fact that those are also places which are so much affected by the climate crisis, which is also, in many ways a product of colonialism, and of imperialist extractivism, really. So, I think there's so many connections to be made there, which are really important. I think the other really, really important point which you've been making is the direct impact then on policy in India and the impact of these of this role of imperialist finance capital in propping up Adani, in financing Adani.
There is a desire now to make sure that profit. The rate of profit is maintained by financial institutions. That is all. One of the ultimate drivers of imperialism is how do you maintain that rate of profit through terror, through violence, through racism, through patriarchy, through hegemony, and India's now fully part of that conversation. Where it's liberalized its economy over the last 30, 40 years. It has a active banking structure, and it's now, taken this awful historic step to put the public assets into the private sector, in which international finance capital is fully invested, and you're seeing the result of that through the rising tensions that Adani and the BJP are doing on the ground, creating the conditions against workers, and having so much knock-on effect with the way in which the exploitation of communities in both the formal and the informal sector, the sort of the rebound, the kind of trickle effect that it would have, to make sure that corporations like Adani have these profits coming in through erosion of wages, through the removal of rights, anything that is within the armory of government labour policy to try and maximise profits. India will be in that process in a way in which has been much more violent than what you would get in so-called liberal democracies.
I mean, I think it's there's a lot happening at the moment in opposition to the new labour codes that have been brought in, which are really very drastic attacks on workers' rights. The notion of the 8-hour day has essentially been abolished and been replaced with the idea of 12-hour working days. The right to strike has been massively attacked. And I think it's also interesting that the way these labor codes, these new laws were presented, actually drew on on Hindu scriptures like Manusmriti to present. And the Manusmriti is something which it's a text which is extremely. It justifies, extreme violence against Dalits and oppressed castes. It's extremely patriarchal, kind of mandating control over women, all through their life cycle and so on. And it's something which the Hindu supremacists actually would like to replace India's constitution with this document. But when they cited it in this presentation of the new labor laws, there was a huge outcry against it. And basically what they were trying to say is that, labor is not something which comes, accompanied by rights. It's actually a social and moral duty. So invoking this concept of Raj Dharma. So in a way, you can see the way in which, Hindutva ideology and these attacks by capital are so, inextricably intertwined, really. When people talk about fascism, they tend to think about the 1930s in Europe. And of course, there are some very important connections with Hindutva, which, Hindutva began. It began in the 19th century, but the RSS was formed in the 1920s, modeled on, Mussolini's youth wing, and then you have these very kind of admiring, relationship with the Nazis. But I think we also have to look at the fact that we're now talking about fascism in a post-colonial context, in the global South. And we're also talking about it in a neoliberal or post-neoliberal era. So I think those make, very important differences in how we understand fascism, and particularly the idea that, the kind of nationalism or hyper-nationalism, which is part of that fascism, it doesn't involve any kind of economic nationalism. Essentially, it involves a promotion of complete subordination of India to
Exactly.
the US and to other imperial powers. And I think that's what, in a way, one of the things which the case of Adani illustrates so clearly.
Exactly. There's going to be now, in my view, a kind of a ramping up of the extent to which Western capital, old money, this is old colonial money, the way you're going to really see the power of Wall Street and London come through the financial markets into India. You've started seeing it through share ownership, investment funds, private equity, share issuances, and corporate bonds, buying Indian assets, able to buy Indian assets, whatever amount is available for sale in India. There is a glut of money, a glut of capital waiting in the wings to be poured into India. And Adani and Modi know this. And that means that it creates the conditions for mass exploitation, very regressive policy. And it's a very, very dangerous situation. It happens through every part of the financial markets as well. There's kind of the vanilla share trading aspect, but there's also, the way in which London and New York are responsible for the global trade of commodities, right? Gold and silver and oil and gas and copper, all these things that Adani is very good at mining. And you're seeing the control of these commodities, the pricing of these commodities, not based on the pricing at which Adani would set it, but based completely subordinate to what the trader in London, a broker in London or a broker in Wall Street determines that to be. And if they determine it to be slightly higher, and the price that Adani is mining it at, needs to be, raised, that is going to take more ruthless action on the ground in those mining communities against the environment, right? Losing environmental controls. So that's sort of where we see the horrible, finance as imperialism, working as it should, working as it's meant to, and we don't often make the connection where when we see stock market indices go up and down and commodity prices go up and down, currency trading goes up and down, but these are an army of workers in London and Wall Street calculating future profits on said company or said commodity or said currency. And the market is telling policymakers around the world, this is the price that we want. And if the price drops, it's up to policymakers through forms of imperialism to make that happen. Right? That's the world in which modern financial markets and imperialism and finance capital operates as. So with the influx of finance capital through the domestic banking system in India, you're seeing Adani really position itself as being the provider of as much of India's infrastructure as possible. Adani would be flying even to Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Israel and promoting Adani as the partner in choice for deals on behalf of Adani.
Well, there's the Haifa port in the Zionist entities is one of the major
exactly.
Adani enterprises there.
Exactly, and that creates this from the government's perspective, that's a strategic asset, right? Because it's through Modi's relationship at a diplomatic level that creates this, creates the reputation and the ecosystem in which Adani can just be like, yeah, I have a whole bunch of backers, including Western capital, behind me, able to take hold of a port. And any industry in which there is a relationship, a diplomatic relationship that Modi is trying to cultivate, and he's doing that more and more. And on the ground in India, the other point to the Adani issue and finance capital going into Adani is that we're now going to witness in the future a sort of a concentration of companies, right? The capitalists always like to talk about competition within, as economists teach, capitalism is good for competition and these sorts of myths, but it never happens. Evidence shows us that it's completely the opposite is true. And with capital, you're always going to get aggressive mergers and acquisitions, underpricing, cartels, oligarchies forming, and India's small to medium enterprises, family businesses. There's going to be a shift. There is going to be a dramatic shift in the way in which these small businesses are going to survive. And I think they're pretty much going to be out of business in the way that the UK lost the corner shop in the 1980s and to the high street supermarkets, and what they did with the buying the supply chain in the farming sector. In India, you're seeing a massive change with small scale farmers and the investment that's going into the agribusiness industry, and the resistance to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why resistance has been so important, actually, as the only thing which can kind of stand in the way of that. Like if you look at the tremendous farmers movement which happened in 2021, which actually succeeded in blocking that complete takeover of Indian agriculture by corporate capital, particularly Adani and Ambani. And that was, something really very inspiring. The fact that, the breadth of solidarity and the way that people are organized. And I think it's only that kind of really, really coherent and really sort of mass-based resistance. We've mentioned, the fact that there's been solidarity, in the centers of imperial power, and that's very important. But it can only be effective if it is, supporting and amplifying the demands which are actually,
coming from the
happening on the ground. And I think that the farmers' movement is a very good example of that. Then, of course, there's the huge ongoing resistance to attacks on citizenship, disenfranchisement of Muslims in particular. You talked about the corner shops collapsing and so on. I think in the Indian context, because of the huge informal sector, that's the pressure is tightening there. But it's also like the only way that the majority of people will survive. The majority of people will not be able to afford the supermarkets which are coming in and so on. But it'll be increasingly squeezed and criminalized and prices will be rising. Prices will be passed on. But and also, of course, most of the people working in those sectors are themselves very poor, are largely oppressed caste or Muslim, so they face all kinds of persecution. The work that we in SASG do around GCB and sort of and talking about bulldozer, so-called bulldozer justice in India, which is really a form of ethnic cleansing. A lot of the targeting is, of course, of people's homes, particularly Muslim people's homes and places of worship, but there's also a huge targeting of very small businesses, which are, people's livelihoods. And some of that relates to the sort of clearing of those forms of provision, for corporates to come in. It also, of course, massively relates to land markets and, again, corporate land grab and so on. So I think, there are so many connections in terms of what's happening day to day, the sort of nodes of repression and violence and, Hindu supremacist ethnic cleansing and the resistance to it. It fits very well, very clearly into these broader
the demands of
processes and
demands of finance capital.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So perhaps it's worth ending thinking about finance capital in India through colonial lens. And if we do that, you can see that wealth extraction, the drain of resources, continues, albeit in financialized form. We talked about the physical movement of produce, goods, and food produce from India to Europe, and then at the dawn of the neoliberal era, post-independence, increasing financialization, debt programs, and now that process, we see in today's form taking the shape of very sophisticated financial instruments dreamt up by bankers and brokers in London and Wall Street, having access to India's vast, once public institutions, but also, other businesses and ventures, even militaristic businesses and ventures. And that's colonialism, a continuation of colonialism through these modern forms of financial instruments.
I think that's a very important lens through which to see this, the colonial one. And I think it's quite ironic, actually, because of the way that, the Hindu supremacists at the moment are really trying to utilize this decolonial rhetoric. Everything is about decolonizing. And when they talk about decolonizing, of course, they're not primarily really talking about the British. They're really talking about Muslim rulers and going back to some mythical past. But, it's very important to then make it absolutely clear just how colonial these structures are, which Modi is and the RSS and the BJP are dragging India ever deeper into, because this is in fact completely enmeshing India in these structures which continuously, as you've shown, extract resources from the labor of its working people. And those resources end up in the colonial imperial centers.
It is ironic, we see the majority of UK Hindutva personnel lined up coming from the finance sector. It's bizarre that they don't see what's under their nose, that this colonial drain, the asset ownership is now facilitated through the corporations that they work in, and how the Modi-Adani regime, the Hindutva regime, was this surgical strike on domestic Indian assets to put them into the financial system, and now that's having that the ability to be betted on, gambled on, traded through a proliferation of financial market instruments that UK Hindutva personnel use and operate themselves, and not seeing the contradiction there.
No, absolutely. And it's, you've talked about sort of organizations like City Hindus and their role in this sort of Hindutva infrastructure in Britain is very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. The old colonial money that maintains London and Wall Street hegemony, that is now taking asset positions, ownership positions in on domestic infrastructure, on businesses, on land, and rights over, therefore, labour.
And I think that's why those who are resisting are really talking about the need for a new independence struggle, both from the grip of the fascists and in relation to imperialism.